Ben Kretz, but you need to be listening when he's talking. I would like Ben Kretz to give me one of the three glaring examples of how the South was considered war-torn. How the Civil War left its mark on three specific areas in the South, and I want you just to give me one of those.
Okay.
Were you here yesterday?
Yes, I was.
How's that notebook working for you?
Good.
Okay, how's your notes from yesterday working for you? Oh, good, okay, all right. So give me one specific area.
Southern agriculture was accommodated because of the weeds.
Okay, just a second, I'm not keying up here. Southern agriculture is true. That's one of the three. Now, Ben, give me one example of how southern agriculture was affected.
Livestock was either taken or ran away.
Okay, give me another one, Caleb Workman. Another example of how southern agriculture was affected.
No slaves.
There were no slaves. Very good. How about another one there, Miss Isabel? Another example of southern agriculture, how it was affected.
There's weeds, definitely, and debris.
Okay, well, okay, but add this to it, because this is kind of why we do this, so you review. The once white
And
cotton
then those
fields,
things,
yeah, the once white cotton fields were full of debris and weeds. Very good. Okay, how about another one, Chloe?
I got the question for you.
Yeah, I don't know another one. I thought we were the
Okay,
seeds.
white cotton fields drew a large harvest of weeds, livestock was driven away or killed, slave labor was gone.
Yes.
How about new crops? What would they need to get new crops?
Seeds.
And what about the seed?
There were no
It was very scarce,
Oh,
okay?
you said-
AD, give me another, AD, give me another example of an area that was affected by the Civil War
There's
itself.
transportation.
Okay, now that's not an area, that's an example. That's why I'm
Well, an
going,
area
that's why
would
I'm
be-
going through this thing. What was the specific, specific thing it left its mark on? One was southern agriculture, but I want the thing, and then we'll do the examples.
Okay, what about their economic life?
Perfect, yeah, economic life in the South. And one example of that was the transportation system was broken down completely, mainly because the Union destroyed it. Okay, Susanna, give me another example of how economic life in the South was affected.
Was it businesses?
What about it?
They were ruined by inflation.
And maybe even by war. Perfect, okay. Banks and businesses had to lock their doors either because of inflation or the fact that they were completely destroyed. And what was the third one, okay? Third example of how economic life in the South ended.
Factories.
They didn't produce anything because they were either smokeless, they weren't working, or they were torn apart, right? Okay, so what was the third example, Hannah, of a specific thing in the South that was affected by the Civil War?
Like education and social?
Institutions. Okay, the examples there is churches and schools were battered and left in ruins. Teachers were killed. Many schools were destroyed. Churches were destroyed because of the war effort. Okay? Now that's going to be on your test for sure. You're going to be asked the three specific areas in the South affected and examples of each. Okay? Now we talk about President Lincoln's plan for the South, Hoyt. What was he planning to do with Southern individuals? What was Lincoln going to do with Southern individuals?
Give them amnesty.
Okay, and what is amnesty?
Kind of like a pardon.
Okay, and what did they have to do, Josh, to gain amnesty? What did the Southerners have to agree to? Two things.
They had to swear not to the Union.
Okay, and what was the other thing they had to do? Agreed to
Federal law?
accept all federal laws, Morgan. Very good, including laws that abolish slavery. Very good. Okay, now, he did not give amnesty to three different groups of people. Mauricio, do you have one group of people that the Southerners were not given, one group of Southerners that were not given amnesty by Lincoln?
There were the like Southern War generals.
Okay, high-ranking officers, very good. Yep, high-ranking officers of the Confederate Army, very good. How about another one, Caleb?
Politicians, Southern politicians that went to the Confederacy from the Union.
Very good. Southern politicians or government officials that once worked for the federal government that went to work for the Confederate government. Very good. Okay, Jacob, tell me the third people, so to speak, Southerners that were not given amnesty.
People that mistreated POWs.
Very good. Those Confederates who mistreated prisoners of war. Now, that's how they treated individuals, okay? Chloe, What was the criteria for a southern state to get to be back in the Union?
A state could return to the Union when 10% of those who voted in the election pledged oath to the Union.
Okay, which election?
I can
In 1860, okay, that was the one that elected Lincoln. Now, why did Lincoln chance make it just 10%? That seems like a low percentage. He wanted to come back in the Union, and there was a lot, somebody mentioned yesterday, the population had diminished some in each state because of the casualties of the war. Okay, very good. Okay, what were the name of the Republicans in Congress, both the House and the Senate, Hannah, that did not agree with Lincoln's plan?
Radical Republican.
They were radical Republicans. And give me one example, Susanna, of one of the most notable radical Republicans. Who was that? Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. And remember that he wanted to guarantee the equal rights of black Americans, and he wanted to educate them so they could actually accept the responsibilities of freedom and be successful. Who was the other one, Wade? The other radical Republican? Thaddeus, good, yes. Thaddeus Stevens, who was a representative from Pennsylvania. And he was a little harder core. He really wanted to punish the South for all the injustices and all the discrimination that they had done to black people during the Confederate rule. Yep.
So what if somebody attacked the USA when, like, after a Civil War?
You know, that's a great question.
What would happen?
We were very vulnerable. And if anybody would have wanted to give us grief from Europe, this would have been the time. But we were in pretty good peacetime here. That's a good point. Okay, now, Congress was so against Lincoln's plan, especially the radical Republicans, they actually sent a bill to Congress called the Wade-Davis bill. And basically, we ended that yesterday with that comment. We were going to tell you what the bill was, right? So the Wade-Davis bill actually called for stronger measures for a southern state to be readmitted into the Union. They, kind of like I said yesterday, wondered, well, gee, only 10% of the people that voted in the election of 1860, it's all it takes to get in back into the Union after you were disloyal? Well, Lincoln, we told you why. Lincoln wanted states in. Well, the radical Republicans weren't so much that way, and the Wade-Davis bill, really what it called for was stronger measures. You had to do more as a state to get back in the Union. Okay? Now, here's the three things that the Wade-Davis bill stated. Okay? Now, actually, it accepted the 10% of citizens in each state. It's accepted that, which was kind of interesting. So, one of the things the Wade-Davis bill stated was the same thing Lincoln stated. When 10% of the citizens in a southern state who voted in the election of 1860 pledged their allegiance to the Union, they could get back in. So they kept that, but they added two more things to it that made it stronger. That's the important thing here. So they did accept Lincoln's pledge of the 10% of the population of the southern state who voted in the election of 1860. If you could get 10%, you're in. However, you also, this was part of the bill, more political power would be given to those Southerners that remained loyal to the Union. And where would they have lived? Thank you, attaboy. They would have lived in the border states. So there were some Southerners in the border states that remained loyal to the Union. And the Wade-Davis bill stated that those individuals that remained loyal to the Union would have more political power than those Southerners who did not. Okay? The other part of the Wade-Davis bill is that if you were going to come into the Union, your new state constitution would have to include the freedom of blacks. You had to have in your state constitution written that the blacks were free in your state. Even though we had abolished slavery, they wanted it in the constitution of each state. So again, the Wade-Davis bill that was sent to Congress, first of all, number one, agreed with Lincoln and stated that when 10% of the citizens in the state that voted in the election of 1860 pledged their allegiance to the Union, that was one criteria. The other criteria was if you were a Southerner and you stayed loyal to the Union in the Civil War, which some did in the border states, then you would get more political power than those Southerners that did not. What you look for?
I borrow a pen.
Yeah. And thirdly, probably the most important one was this, that the new state constitution, when you put every state that seceded, had to put together a new state constitution. And that state constitution had to state in the constitution that blacks were free, in the constitution. That's what the Wade Davis bill did. That was sent for vote in July of 1864. Went to vote, both in the House and the Senate. Okay, July of 1864, the Wade Davis bill went for vote, as stated in the election. Okay, and it passed by a small margin. Okay, so the Wade Davis bill, as written, as I mentioned to you, went to vote in July of 1864 and did pass by a small margin. Now, Lincoln didn't like it. He thought it was going to cause him trouble getting those states into the Union. And getting those states into the Union was crucial to put the nation back together. Okay? He wanted to rebuild the Union, and if he didn't have all the states in there, that was going to be a problem, was it not? So he didn't like it for that reason. Another reason he didn't like it is he didn't think that just putting the abolishment of slavery in state constitutions was enough. Because how did slavery get abolished? Did anybody vote on it? How did it get abolished? Emancipation Proclamation, which was simply a presidential proclamation. So where did Lincoln think that the official abolishment of slavery really should be stated? In the Constitution of the United States. So Lincoln opposed the Wade Davis bill, one, because he thought it would make him harder to rebuild the Union. He needed all the states in, not a few. That's why he only put the 10% in the first place. So he was against it for the reason he thought it would be harder to get the states in the Union, which would make it harder for him to rebuild the Union. The second reason he didn't like it is because he thought the abolishment of slavery should officially be done by an amendment to the United States Constitution, not in each state constitution. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, that does make sense. Okay? Well, what's happened here is Lincoln's made some enemies. Okay, and we're kind of stuck here because the Wade Davis bill goes through, but he vetoes it. It's a problem, blah, blah, blah. He's made some enemies. Which takes us to our next subtopic, which gets a little interesting, the planned kidnapping of President Lincoln. Seriously, how many people in here know that President Lincoln was assassinated? Okay, if you're alive, you know that. How many knew actually the plan wasn't to assassinate him, it was to kidnap him? Okay, good. Well, that's good. We're going to learn that. Good. So, now, whether or not Lincoln could have won acceptance for his plan for the South was never answered, okay? And as I mentioned, Lincoln made many enemies after the Civil War. Not only from the North, but from the South. He had a lot of enemies. Matter of fact, historians will tell you that, as sad as it sounds, Lincoln might have been the most hated man in history at that point. And you wouldn't think of that when you hear the great things about Lincoln, but he was a very disliked man in July of 1864. Really was. Probably one of the most hated men in American history at the time. Okay, now, here's the story of the kidnapping. 2 days after Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, do you remember that? President Lincoln addressed a crowd outside the White House. He gave a speech. Okay? So 2 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Lincoln gave a speech to a small crowd outside the White House. Okay? One of the people in the crowd listening to Lincoln's speech was a Southern sympathizer by the name of John Wilkes Booth. Okay? One of the people listening to Lincoln's speech 2 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox was a Southern sympathizer by the name of John Wilkes Booth. And he was someone that really hated Lincoln. He hated everything Lincoln stood for, did not like him in any way, shape, or form. Okay? So he stood out, John Wilkes Booth stood out, and he listened to Lincoln's speech 2 days after Lee surrendered Appomattox outside the White House. Well, Booth was a guy that kind of wanted revenge. And so what he did in the summer, late summer of 1864, is he began developing a plan to kidnap Lincoln. So in the late summer of 1864, John Wilkes Booth began developing a plan to kidnap Lincoln. Okay? And what he was going to do, his plan was to kidnap Lincoln and take him to Richmond. He was going to kidnap Lincoln and take him to Richmond, excuse me. He was going to kidnap Lincoln and take him to Richmond. And what was he going to trade Lincoln for?
Money.
And
Freedom.
Southern prisoners of war. So his plan was to kidnap Lincoln, take him to Richmond, and hold him in return for Confederate prisoners of war and possibly money. And there's a big story about some back channel things on money after the Civil War, which we're going to get into later. Okay? So Lincoln's plan is to kidnap Lincoln, take him to Richmond, hold him hostage, so to speak, for the release of Southern prisoners of war and possibly some cash. Okay, so in order to get this plan going, he organized a group of what we called co-conspirators. And this was in January of 1865 when he put this group together. And you're going to see pictures of them all, which I handed out. So this is in January of 65, so don't get mixed up. You have more pictures than we have people at this point. Here were his first group of co-conspirators. Samuel Arnold, they're all on your ID sheet. Samuel Arnold, George Atzerodt, David Harold, Michael O'Laughlin, Lewis Powell, and John Surratt. I'll give you some time to get those down. Okay? So Wilkes Booth, John Wilkes Booth puts together a group of co-conspirators in January of 1865, which included the following people: Samuel Arnold, George Atzerodt, David Harold, Michael O'Laughlin, Lewis Powell, and John Surratt, all on your ID sheet in
Lewis
order.
Powell isn't.
Lewis Powell's not?
He is.
Wait,
Oh, but he's not on the orange sheet?
he's not on that.
Okay, he should be on the orange sheet, sorry. Lewis Powell, but he is on your pictures, okay? So those were the co-conspirators. Add Lewis Powell to that. Those were the co-conspirators that Booth first put together in January of 1865. Okay? Now, they had to meet somewhere to plan strategy, right? Well, they added another guy to their group once they got organized. Dr. Samuel Mudd was added to their group. Dr. Samuel Mudd. And they met at a tavern, combination tavern boarding house that was owned by Mary Surratt. So they added Dr. Samuel Mudd to the co-conspirators, and they had their meetings at a kind of a combination tavern boarding house owned by Mary Surratt. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing. On March 17th, 1865, this group planned to capture President Lincoln as he attended a play located on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. This was March. On March 17th, 1865, the group planned to capture President Lincoln because he was going to attend a play. He liked to go to plays. He was going to attend a play on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. Yes?
Why did they try killing Luther?
Whatever. Well, we ain't got to that yet. We're gonna. Hey, that a boy though. Where'd you hear that? Oh, you've been that far already? Well, you got a little top. Okay, good. Now, Lincoln decided not to attend the play that night, which ruined Booth's plot to kidnap him. He decided not to go. So they're already on March 17th, 1865. They're going to kidnap the president. They're going to take him to Richmond. They're going to hold him hostage for Confederate prisoners of war and possibly some money, gold. Well, he doesn't show up, changes his plans, which really ticks off Booth. And Booth got a little angry, so he changed his plans from kidnapping at this point to assassination. So no longer was he going to kidnap him, he was going to assassinate him.
Had Lincoln gone to that show that night, he might have just been kidnapped.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. So that takes us to our next subtopic then, which is the assassination of President Lincoln. And we're going to get into Andrew's question about what happened to some other people that were in the government. Okay? Very good. So the assassination of President Lincoln.
Mr. Burke,
Yes,
why would they just abruptly change it to assassination?
Booth was a different duck.
Yeah, I was gonna say, was he like?
He's a little bit of a different duck. And so he had a temper, he got pissed, quite frankly. And he says, well, hell with it. Well, next time we'll just assassinate him. That was his thought. Okay? Well, on the evening of April 14th, 1865, the president and his wife, along with 14 other guests, were scheduled to watch another theater performance at Ford's Theater in downtown Washington, D.C. Okay, so on April 14th, 1865, President and Mrs. Lincoln, along with 14 guests, were scheduled to watch a theater performance at Ford's Theater in downtown Washington. The name of the play, anybody know? Our American Cousin. That was the name of the play. Anybody want to take a guess, and maybe Andrew, you might know this, or Hannah, or Christine, or maybe Mauricio? Who were among the 14 guests that were going to go with the President and Mrs. Lincoln? Who was scheduled to go? Pretty famous person. General Grant and his wife were scheduled to go with them as well.
Did they go?
So they were among the 14 guests that were scheduled to attend the play. Now let's talk about April 14th, 1865, before the play starts. Okay, we know what they're going to do. They're scheduled to go with 14 guests that evening to watch Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. Okay, well, early in the day, President Lincoln actually said this to one of his aides. You don't have to write it down, but just listen. Early that day, this is what Lincoln stated to one of his aides. Quote, "I believe there are men who want to take my life, and I have no doubt they will do it." Lincoln knew he was in trouble. He knew he had a lot of enemies. And he told one of his aides that morning that he knew there were people who would like to take his life, and he had no doubt they would probably do it. Now, he didn't know it was going to happen that night, but he did say it. Okay? Now, also what happened on April 14th prior to the play is General Grant canceled his plans to join President Lincoln. And 12 others also canceled. Just decided they didn't want to go. So how many guests is he going to have now with him? No? 2. Right?
4.
So 12 others and Mr. and Mrs. Grant's 14. How many were supposed to go? 16 guests. So Lincoln's only going to have 2 guests with him that night.
I thought you said 14.
Did I say 14?
Yeah.
Well, Grant and his wife are part of the 14.
Yeah, there you go. So that makes sense, yeah. Okay?
Mine too.
Just prepare.
Yeah, actually, I screwed that up. Yeah, there were 16 guests that were supposed to go, yes.
Why did they not have really any security?
Well, we're gonna talk about that, it's a good question, okay? So, there's 16 are supposed to go. 12 cancel that day, along with, just a second, I'm gonna make sure I get this right. No, Grant and his wife and 12 others canceled, that's 14. There were 16 that were supposed to go, that left 2. The only 2 that kept their invitations to go with the president was Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. Those are the only 2 that kept their invitation to go with Mr. and Mrs. President and Mrs. Lincoln. Major Henry Rathbone, I think he's on your sheet, and his fiancée, Clara Harris. Aren't they both on there? They do a bad job. No? Henry Rathbone and Clara Harris. They were ones that kept their invitation. So Lincoln has decided he's going to go to the play. And unfortunately, most of his guests have canceled, but not Major Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara. Now, in answering Caleb's question, you didn't have Secret Service in those days, like you do now. But they did have people kind of protect the president. And the man that would be guarding Lincoln's seat at Ford's Theater was John Parker. He was a member of the Washington, D.C. Police Department. So he would be Lincoln's bodyguard for the evening. Okay, but they didn't have Secret Service then. Okay, Secret Service didn't come for quite a while. So the person who would be guarding Lincoln's box seat at the play and guarding the president would be John Parker, who was a member of the Washington, D.C. Police Department. Okay, everybody up on this? At 8:30 p.m. that evening, the presidential party arrived at Ford's Theater. Mrs. Lincoln, the president, Major Rathbone, and his fiancée arrived at 8:30 that evening at Ford's Theater. Huh? And they were a little late. That's okay. If you're the president, they'll wait for you. That'll come up next year. At approximately 9:30, John Wilkes Booth arrived at the theater with a single-shot Derringer pistol and a hunting knife. So, an hour after the presidential party gets there, at 9:30, John Wilkes Booth arrives with a single-shot Derringer pistol, which is a very small pistol, and a hunting knife. Well, he arrived at the theater and then he left and he went to a nearby saloon for a drink. So Booth arrives at 9:30, checks it out a little bit, leaves, and goes to a nearby saloon for a drink. Now as he got off his horse in the alley behind Ford's Theater, he asked a young man, Joseph Burroughs, who worked at the theater, to hold his horse. Okay? So he asked Joseph Burroughs, a boy that worked at Ford's Theater, if he would hold his horse in the alley while he went in and had a drink. Okay? So that tells you that Booth was going to act and get out of there. He wasn't tying his horse up. He was having this boy hold it. Okay? Well, he left the saloon and arrived back at Ford's Theater about 10:07 p.m. Okay? So he goes, has a drink or two at the saloon. After arriving at 9:30, then heads back and arrives back at the theater about 10:07. Now, nobody thought much of it. He wasn't questioned as he even walked toward the presidential booth as Lincoln watched the play, because it was already going, because he was a what? What was his profession? Anybody know? He was an actor also. So they saw him at Ford's Theater. They didn't think anything of him walking up towards the president's booth, because he was a fairly good and fairly famous actor, to be honest with you. So Booth very handsome, popular actor of the day, recognized by many in the acting profession. As a result, he had no problem. He wasn't questioned as he walked the presidential booth as Lincoln watched the play. Well, John Parker, who was the bodyguard assigned to Lincoln that night, had abandoned his post, and he was kind of doing his own thing. He didn't, I guess, see any threat, so he abandoned his post and went, and nobody knows really too much what he did. But he wasn't there, okay? He was in the theater, but not there, right with the president. Well, at 10:15 p.m., Booth slipped quietly into the presidential booth. Matter of fact, you can still go there today, and there was a hole that somebody had taken a knife and just carved out that was already there. The Booth actually looked through to see where Lincoln was sitting before he walked in. Okay? So he walked in at 10:15, went right up to President Lincoln, who was looking that way, stuck the Derringer in the back of his head, right next to his head, pulled the trigger. One-shot Derringer, right in the back of the head. So again, at approximately 10:15 p.m., Booth slipped quietly into the presidential booth and shot President Lincoln in the back of the head at point-blank range. Just took the pistol right at the back of his head and shot him. Well, after Lincoln was shot, Major Rathbone and Booth struggled. I mean, he saw what he did, and the Major grabbed Booth, and they struggled. Okay? So what did Booth do? Because he had no more shots, he slashed Major Rathbone with his knife in the arm, slashed his arm. Okay? So after he shot Lincoln, Major Rathbone and John Wilkes Booth struggled, and finally Booth slashed the Major with a knife. What did he do then, if you know your history much?
He ran.
Well, no, he actually jumped.
out of there.
He jumped, and I've been there many times, he jumped from the balcony onto the stage during the play, and,
Broke his leg.
well, I'll tell you what he said, but what, he broke his leg. Yeah, he broke his leg. As he jumped, there were 1,000 people in the crowd, and he yelled, "Sic Semper Tyrannis," which means,
Well,
oh, go ahead.
what they said there was like two things he wanted to say.
Well, according to witness, he yelled, "Sic Semper Tyrannis," which meant, as always to tyrants. You know, write that down. But he jumped on, he shot the president, struggled with Rathbone, slashed Rathbone with his knife, jumped off the stage, which is higher than the ceiling to here, maybe twice as high, to be honest with you. Broke his leg as he yelled that quote, which was disputed, like Andrew said. There was a couple things could have been said. Well, he's dragging his broken leg. He escapes through the back door of the stage, grabs his horse from the boy that's holding it, and rides off into the night. Okay? And what he does is he leaves behind a mortally wounded president. What does that mean if you're mortally wounded?
You're gonna die.
Yeah, you're not dead, but you're going to die. Okay? So, Booth leaves behind a mortally wounded president. And they took the president from Ford's Theater right across the street to the Peterson House. And it's still called that today, where they tried to help him survive. So he was taken over to the Peterson House, which was a boarding house, and put into a bed over there as doctors rushed to his aid. Okay, right across the street.
Did they do that because they didn't want him to die inside the theater?
Well,
The place was kind of near.
Yeah, and I think part of it is it was a public area, and they wanted to try to have some privacy. But I think everybody was pretty certain. And you got to remember, would Lincoln have lived in 2015? Maybe. I don't know. I mean, it was a different game then. You know what I'm saying?
Probably not, because they're using a different gun.
Yeah. So, they continue on. And at 7:22 a.m. the next morning, which would have been April 15, (1865), Lincoln died, surrounded by friends and cabinet members. And you saw that on the film Blue and the Gray, right? The end there.
Yeah.
So what did Edwin Stanton say, one of his cabinet members, when he died? You remember?
Some to the ages.
Now he belongs to the ages. Yep. So at 7:22 a.m. the next morning, April 15th, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln died surrounded by friends and cabinet members. Now, the nation just reeled in shock and disbelief. Even though he wasn't well liked, the assassination of an American president is a shocking thing. Now, Andrew has some insight, and we'll talk about this tomorrow. He said, well, what about the other people that were involved, that were attacked? Well, Booth's plans not only included the assassination of the president, but also he had some plans for other high-ranking officers of the government, and we will tell you tomorrow what those plans were and where Booth ended up. Okay? All right, Isabel, we did record this, so I'll get this thing posted.
I don't know, we didn't go over it.